on gender-based violence. You will recall, colleagues, that the development of the Sadc model law on gender-based violence falls within the scope of the Sadc Parliamentary Forum of developing model laws to assist member states to implement existing regional and international obligations across the thematic areas of regional concern and interest. Sadc Parliamentary Forum has developed model laws across some of these areas of regional integration, including the model law on eradicating child marriages, children already in marriage. Colleagues also developed the Sadc model law on elections. We have developed the Sadc model law on HIV and AIDS. We're now in the process of developing this model law on GBV and others. And as part of the methodology, the model lawmaking process has 3 key steps, namely the initiation phase, where the plenary adopts a decision for a model law to be developed. And the second stage is the drafting stage, where the actual development of the model law takes place. And thirdly, the adoption process. So as part of ensuring that all stakeholders on board, the model lawmaking process entails consultations with stakeholders, and hence this sensitization workshop for the media. At this juncture, allow me to recognize our dignitaries, namely the Secretary General of the Sadc Parliamentary Forum, Madame Boemo Sehoma. I also wish to recognize our keynote speaker, Pamela Dube, who is a human rights, media, and gender activist. We also have in our midst our distinguished drafter, Eva Jala, a seasoned pair of hands, and has been part of Sadc PF's processes of developing model laws.
Recording in progress.
I also wish to recognize the Commissioner, Maira Teresa Manuela, Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women in Africa and Special Rapporteur on Prisons, Conditions of Detention, and Policing in Africa. And lastly, allow me to also recognize Kiali Walker, Kelly Dambuza, the Sadc Program Officer, Gender-Based Violence, who is going to give us our vote of thanks, our closing remarks. At this juncture, because of the time we have lost, allow me to commence the program by inviting the Secretary General of the Sadc Parliamentary Forum, Madame Boemo Sehoma, to deliver her welcome remarks and set the tone for the commencement of this event. I invite you, Madame SG. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues. Thank you, Director of Ceremonies. Before I give my welcome remarks, you may wish to share the program for the event. I'm getting so many messages. Our participants do not have the program for this particular meeting, so that the context that I'll be setting is well understood. Welcome to this virtual sensitization and engagement session on the development of the Sadc model law on gender-based violence for media practitioners in the Sadc region, hosted by the Sadc Parliamentary Forum and partners from the UN agencies, civil society organizations, academia, who form part of the technical working group for the development of the model law on gender-based violence. Allow me to pay tribute to our guests. Let me recognize Honorable Commissioner Maria Teresa Manuela, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women in Africa and the Special Rapporteur on Prisons, Conditions of Detention and Policing in Africa. Allow me to recognize and welcome Ms. Pamela Dube, a seasoned media specialist, a human rights advocate, a gender activist, who will be our keynote speaker for this particular session. I'd also like to recognize Ms. Kyaleboga Kelly Dambuza, representing the Sadek Gender Unit Head, Mr. Dr. Pizzo, and coming from the Southern African Development Community. Allow me to also recognize Ms. Caroline Peters, representing our community of advocates on gender-based violence. I'd also like to recognize Ms. Eva Jala, our esteemed draftsperson for the gender-based violence model law and a seasoned legal practitioner and advocate. I'd also like to recognize our media practitioners who are here present. I'm well informed that we have representatives from the parliaments of Sadek, from public and private entities in the Sadek region, and we would like to recognize you in your diversity and the hierarchy that you come to the table with. I'd also like to recognize the members of the Technical Working Group on Gender-Based Violence. We have, among others, executive directors of organizations, heads and directors of units from the UN agencies, from civil society organizations, academia, among others. Let me also just simply say, welcome our distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor and privilege for me to welcome you to this landmark event, which has been instrumental in ensuring that the issue of gender-based violence is kept on the radar. The development of the Sadek model law on gender-based violence is therefore a historic landmark that the Southern African region must take an opportunity to embrace and catalyze processes so that the community of those who have suffered at the hands of violence finds relief. Today, ladies and gentlemen, marks the beginning of the process of taking forward consultations with various stakeholders on the development of this gender-based violence model law. You will begin to hear more about the stakeholders who have contributed to this particular model law, and we're reaching out to you as media practitioners to assist us with the visibility, knowledge sharing, and popularization of the contents of this model laws to the citizens of Sadek at all levels, to ensure that the citizens of Sadek see the value of this model law, that the stakeholders, be it at academic level, be it at advocacy level, find their role in ensuring that this model law is embraced, this model law gets the necessary contribution, and that ultimately it can influence the decisions that have been advocated for in the model law. Ladies and gentlemen, as the Director of Ceremony indicated, the Sadek model law emanated from the highest policy-making organ of the Sadek Parliamentary Forum. It came through a motion which was tabled by women parliamentarians who form part of the organ that we refer to as the Regional Women's Parliamentary Caucus. This caucus constitutes members or chairpersons of National Women's Caucus at national level and all women who are nominated to attend the Sadc Parliamentary Forum as members. I therefore want us to applaud these women who have put us on this path and who have sponsored this motion for us eradicating the forms of violence. The motion was unanimously adopted by the members of the Sadc Parliamentary Forum and by extension by all Sadc member parliaments. The drafting of this model law, ladies and gentlemen, is being developed in a context where there are many global and regional initiatives aimed at ending gender-based violence and its effects on our societies. So this is not a new issue. This is a matter that has been with us over time. The essence of this gender-based violence model law will seek to provide a harmonized legal framework aimed at protecting those who are
pour protéger ceux et celles qui sont marginalisés, protéger ceux et celles qui ont expérimenté les violences basées sur le genre et dans l'espoir de promouvoir un développement durable et socio-économique pour nos communautés. Je vais partager avec vous, chers collègues, mesdames et messieurs, le fait que le Forum parlementaire de la Sadec est composé d'au moins 15 parlements membres de la Sadec.
De la région de la Sadec.
Il y a encore les Comores qui devraient nous rejoindre pour que nous arrivions à 16.
Endeavor to ensure that we work across all political institutions. We work across academia platforms. We work across civic organizations, and we ensure that at all times, when we develop tools such as this one, they have the potential to impact on national legislation, and they are perceived to ensure that they enhance the role of members of parliament in their lawmaking roles. Over time, as the Director of Ceremony has indicated, we have developed several model laws and we have gained lessons from these model laws. We have found that such model laws always test the ability of parliaments to negotiate public policy. It helps us protect the people's rights that members of parliament represent. And it also ensures that the executive are always given areas for persuading them to improve the well-being of our citizens. And this is why we're here today and inviting you to share with us this journey, that as we engage various stakeholders, as we draw from lessons previously on various model laws, we emerge victorious through your tools that you use in your trade to sensitize the populace, to ensure that you can share as many stories, you can speak on radio and share the impact of gender-based violence on our communities and ensure that we can focus on the eradication or mitigation of such. At the Sadc Parliamentary Forum, we're very ambitious, and we recognize the role that the media plays in ensuring that we meet our democratic ideals, that we are mindful of the protocols and the treaties that have been signed, that we bring to the surface and into the public arena debates around some of these critical issues, and in particular, issues around human rights, issues around lawmaking, and the role of parliament, if we look at some of these instruments. We are therefore happy to have you on board, and we believe that as we look at some of these issues, which will be presented by the drafter, we'll have a keen eye in looking at what treaties are relevant in this instance. What is the state required to do or domesticate in the provisions that the drafter will be sharing with you? I hope that we'll be able to frame these discussions in the language that is building, in a language that allows lawmakers to join the bandwagon wherever they are and the community of advocates, rather than in a rhetorical term in terms of what needs to be done. We're looking up to you to push the agenda of domestication, because these are not new issues. These are issues that have been adopted by countries, and we hope that in this process of transformation, you will help us influence the amendment to reflect the standards that are required for countries to move forward in amending their policies, in ensuring that our communities are protected and not feel isolated, that the political processes that have intent and that should effectively engage and inform policies are actually scrutinized and taken to mean something for the people that we represent. This is also a process that you'll realize that it will be critical in building capacities. So while we have formal workshops such as this one, we also appeal to you to surface the lived experiences of our communities so that there's a human face around the issues that we're discussing, and not necessarily that these issues are just technical. While we have the convening power as a Sadc Parliamentary Forum, we look forward to you as the media to push the debates and help us discuss the issue in a rather much more simplistic manner, and in a manner that will push the agenda of policy forward in our various jurisdictions. We hope that you'll help us bring sanity to the issues of gender-based violence. You'll help us look at African Union resolutions. You look at regional economic communities resolutions on the same matter, and help us make it manageable for the ordinary person and other stakeholders. We have traditional authorities, we have women groups, we have human rights lawyers, among others, whom we believe you may wish to interrogate, you may wish to engage in the consultation process so that we reaffirm the importance of gender-based violence and inclusion of voices of various stakeholders. Honorable colleagues, honorable members, and stakeholders here represented, effective communication can only be achieved if your expertise and services are fully harnessed to drive this regional initiative of sensitizing, popularizing this gender-based violence model law to our various stakeholders. And therefore, on behalf of the Sadc Parliamentary Forum, I would like to welcome you all, and I wish you fruitful deliberations. I believe that at the end of this session, you'll be well equipped to begin to lead on various thematic issues, to lead on asks to government, to lead on asks to parliaments, to lead on asks to civil society organization. And we also look forward to hearing from you so that we can improve our gender-based model law provisions to ensure that citizens and stakeholders feel provided for and that we don't leave anyone behind. I thank you. Muito obrigada. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, SG, for those incisive remarks. And among the many things that I take from the Secretary General's remarks is the call to the media to say, this is your show. We need to hear the human stories. We need to experience diverse voices speaking on the issue of gender-based violence, and the media and media practitioners stand as the most strategic partner to be able to deliver in that regard. And also the offer of Sadc PF's convening powers to the stakeholders to come together to be able to add their voices to the issue of gender-based violence, the leadership role of women parliamentarians of the region who saw the need to move a motion for the region to develop the model law on gender-based violence. So thank you very much, SG, for those remarks. and I'm sure colleagues from the media would have picked a few things that are critical as they seek to frame the issues under consideration. At this juncture, I wish to invite our keynote address, Madame Pamela Dube, whom, as you heard, is a very experienced human rights activist, a media and gender practitioner, and we are ready to listen to you, Madame Dube. I wish to hand over to you at this juncture. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introductions, and thank you for the invite, Director of Ceremonies. First and foremost, let me recognize and greet the Sadec Parliamentary Forum Secretary General, Mme Boemo Sekgoma, Dumela Mme. And also, I wish to recognize all the distinguished delegates from the media fraternity in the Sadec region as a whole. Ladies and gentlemen, Dumelang in my language. First and foremost, let me just appreciate the invitation and say it is indeed a great honor and pleasure that I address you today as the Southern African Development Community Parliamentary Forum is preparing to undertake stakeholder consultations on the development of the model law on gender-based violence. We all agree that GBV is prohibited under international law, and it is viewed as a violation of human rights. Various human rights instruments at both international and regional level prohibit gender-based violence. At the regional level, this includes the Protocol to the African Union on Women's Rights and the Sadec Gender Protocol. Sadec member states are party to these instruments, and they have an obligation to take steps towards the eradication of gender-based violence. The GBV epidemic is an impediment for efforts to achieve national, regional, continental, and global development goals. GBV not only has terrible effects on the survivors, but impacts negatively on society at large with serious social and economic consequences. It is an enormous public health problem, but it's often overlooked. Survivors and victims of gender-based violence are at high risk of severe and long-lasting health problems, including death from injuries or suicide. Health consequences can include poor mental health, chronic pain, blindness, deafness, unwanted pregnancy, and sexually transmitted infections, which include HIV and AIDS. GBV is therefore a regional issue which requires drastic national interventions through the highest tool of governance, which is the law. Hence, we are here today. You may ask, why is Sadec interested in the prevention of GBV, gender-based violence? Of course, we can say the answer is obvious, but maybe let's discuss that. Peace and security have always been central to Sadec's regional integration agenda. In spite of this, gender-based violence continues to be a threat to human security, peace, and development. The Sadec Blueprint document, namely the revised Regional Indicative Strategic Development Plan of 2015 to 2020, and the Strategic Indicative Plan of the Organ on Politics, Defense, and Security Cooperation, recognize the prevention and reduction of GBV as a catalyst for attaining serene peace and security conducive environment. The revised Sadec Protocol on Gender and Development clearly identifies GBV as an area of concern and has proposed several approaches to be adopted by Sadec member states. In addition, the the Sadc gender policy explicitly suggests that Sadc's approach of addressing GBV should go beyond just looking at the act of violence. In 2018, a regional strategic framework of action for addressing gender-based violence was developed to facilitate the implementation and monitoring of Sadc protocol on gender and development, which sets a target for reducing GBV incidences by half by the year 2030. Following that, the Sadc gender-based violence strategy and its framework of action of 2018 to 2030 was approved by the Sadc ministers responsible for gender equality and women's affairs in Pretoria, South Africa, in July 2018. The Sadc GBV strategy is aligned to relevant regional, continental, and international gender and GBV instruments. Despite these and other complementary efforts to address the impact of GBV in the Sadc region, it remains amongst the most severe and widespread human rights violations in Southern Africa and continues to violate the rights of innocent women, men, boys, and girls, with women and girls being disproportionately affected in comparison to their male counterparts. The majority of GBV is perpetrated by intimate partners or husbands at both global and regional level. Whilst 1 in 2 women have experienced GBV at some point of their lives at the global level, some countries in the Sadc region have higher instances of GBV. Although 13 out of Sadc countries have laws on domestic violence and 14 have laws on sexual assault, GBV is still viewed as acceptable in most countries. The laws exist, but it still happens in our countries. The onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in the region has exacerbated the situation, resulting in the intensification of instances of GBV, and particularly violence against women and girls. Throughout the region, reports of abuse such as intimate partner violence, sexual harassment, child marriage, female genital mutilation, domestic and sexual abuse of women and girls, online abuse, harassment and exploitation of children have increased by 20%. May I just pause there to just mention that as we are speaking as journalists today, we're speaking to the media houses today, issues of sexual harassment in the workplace are at a highest level of our times. We are seeing that we are working on that area with Women in News program, and we have found that our newsrooms are still silent on issues of sexual harassment, but it's on the rise and it happens everywhere. So as we are speaking as the media, we need to internalize that fact and say, what is it that we're doing to fight the scourge of gender-based violence? Calls to helplines during this period of the COVID-19 pandemic have increased fivefold in some countries because of COVID-19. Restrictive measures that have been imposed by states have resulted in women being unable to escape from the home and from the harm and to seek protection and redress. This in turn has magnified existing structural problems such as poverty, inequality, crime, high unemployment, and systematic criminal justice failures. You'll recall, colleagues, that during the lockdowns that happened around the region, there were lots of reports of teenage pregnancies or young girls who were locked in the homes, falling pregnant. And the question was, who was responsible if they were locked in the homes? It could only mean family members were responsible. And that is challenging and that is concerning. Ladies and gentlemen, Sadec, like other regions, face different challenges in the response to GBV. Key amongst these challenges are inadequate national laws on GBV, inadequate national instrument frameworks, and inadequate data and gender disaggregated statistics, as well as outdated laws. It is against this background and in response to calls from various stakeholders for regional approach to meet the goal of eliminating GBV by 2030 that the Sadec Parliamentary Forum commissioned the development of a model law on GBV that will be used by Sadec member states to prevent, address, and combat all forms of GBV. The model law on GBV is meant to guide Sadec member states in the ratification, domestication, and implementation of relevant international and regional principles, guidelines, and obligations that inform gender-based violence prevention and response interventions at member states level. Colleagues, you have been selected to be the first category of stakeholders to be engaged as part of the consultation process in recognition of your strategic and important potential that the media has to contribute to the prevention and elimination of GBV in the Sadec region. I therefore call upon you to join hands with the Sadec PF as it rolls out the Stakeholder Consultative Forum for the development of the Sadec model law on GBV. Specifically, I wish to call on you to raise awareness on the impact of GBV in the Sadec region, to raise awareness on the role of the model law, the role that the model law can play in the prevention of GBV, and to raise awareness on the stakeholder consultative process for the media law. Colleagues, it is important that we do this because maybe let's just take a step back and go back to the words of the Secretary General when she said, give face to gender-based violence. We need to step back to say, yes, there can be laws. Laws are there to prevent. Laws are there to make sure that people behave in a certain way. But if laws are just there in paper, and even in the implementation process, we don't see the impact, we need to be able to rise as media workers. We need to be able to step up to the plate and be able to say, what is it that we're doing? What is my contribution? What is my contribution in fighting gender-based violence? You'll recall that during the HIV and AIDS, when it was at its height, the pandemic, there was a lot of denial within our communities until we started seeing the face of HIV and AIDS. When people started coming forward, when people stepped forward to say, I am infected, I am affected, and people could identify the problem and they could see the face of the problem and stigmatization could be dealt with. We are faced with the same scourge right now today called gender-based violence, which is so real because it's in the homes, it's in the offices, it's on the streets. And until we step to the plate and be able to give face to this and be able to speak to the heart of the problem, very little will be achieved. Laws can be made. Our leadership can rise to the occasion. But if we ourselves who are in the forefront of giving information and disseminating information are not there to step forward, very little will be achieved. With those few remarks, Your Excellency, distinguished delegates, may I conclude my statement by thanking Sadec Parliamentary Forum for the opportunity to be part of this historic occasion. I wish all the distinguished delegates fruitful deliberations. Thank you very much. Ke a leboga. Moti obrigado. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Ke a leboga. Pamela Dube, for that very moving key statement and key address, which raises very important issues in terms of the context, the regional context in which the GBV model law is being developed, and more importantly, place the media as a critical and central player in linking the regional policy space and the efforts that are being made with the citizens, including giving a voice, a face to the victims. And I'm just reminded of a story I was reading, which has been trending in Zimbabwe currently, where a 14-year-old girl died while giving birth at a shrine of one of the independent African churches. And you must listen to the voices of the relatives who were denied access, even at a point when the young girl was battling to give birth up to the point of death. And the reason why there is outrage right now in Zimbabwe testifies to the power of the media in terms of highlighting GBV issues and prompting action from various stakeholders. And I'm glad you highlighted all these issues, including the fact that even at regional policy level, the regional instruments such as the Strategic Indicative Plan for the organ relating to peace and security, the Protocol on Gender and Development, place GBV at the core as a regional issue that warrants our attention, as a matter that affects development, that affects the entire society, not just the victims. And the media stand as our look-up to partner and role player. If everyone must get to know about the ills of gender-based violence and the efforts that are being undertaken, including the development of the model law. It is not until these interventions reach to the end users that they become effective. Thank you very much once more, Madam Pamela. We sincerely appreciate the presentation. At this juncture, allow me to invite our main presentation from our main presenter. I say our main presentation from our main presenter because we're now going to look into the content of the Sadc model law.
Au contenu de cette loi modèle de la Sadec sur la violence basée sur le genre. C'est Madame Eva Diala qui va nous faire cette présentation de la loi modèle.
Allow me to give you the floor and shoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Krusai. Greetings to all of you from the sunny city of Lusaka, Zambia.
Nous tous de Lusaka en
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. I'm Eva Diala, as I have been introduced from Benvie Associates. I'm going to start with briefly explaining the scope and style that I undertook in developing this model law. The presentation is merely a concise exposition of the model law, and I'm sure you've all got copies of it, and they have been translated and sent to all the media personnel. So my presentation, I'll have to go very quickly because I've only been given 45 minutes. It's a comprehensive exposition of the model law, but it's also very profound. So you bear with me when I'm going a little fast in trying to cover as much ground as we can in 45 minutes. I'll be discussing the key elements of the model law to provoke discussions in those areas without stopping discussions on other provisions of the model law. Therefore, we look at the key areas towards the end of explaining the model law. So please feel free at any point to take notes and let's have a profound discussion afterwards. The model law will be useful to most member states who don't have legislation on GBV, as it provides guidance on the scope and content of GBV provisions to be provided in national GBV laws. This GBV law will encourage national legislatures to enact laws where these do not exist or where they do exist but do not conform with the model law, to review such laws and enact relevant GBV laws that conform. The GBV model law will support national laws during the implementation stage, especially where there are gaps in national laws. The model law will be a yardstick to national policy analysts, legislatures, and implementers as to best practices in enacting and dealing with GBV. It will reinforce a commonality of a regional approach in dealing with GBV laws, measures, and strategies to help eliminate GBV. It will also be a stimulus for debate, awareness, and advocacy. So the media can effectively use the GBV model law for awareness and advocacy. And that's why I felt it was very important that we explain the basis of the model law, how we arrived at the model law. So these explanatory notes are based on wide research, philosophical concepts, legal jurisprudence, you name it, to give it depth, so that it has meaning and can be identifiable with so many areas that affect GBV. So these explanatory notes are there for your use. And if you go to the first part of the model law, you will be able to read quite comprehensively what we were tackling at any one point when developing the GBV model law. So what is the rationale and objectives of the model law? Very briefly, because later on, when we're looking at the key areas, we'll look at the objectives of the model law. The GBV model law is a governance tool, or will be a governance tool, to assist Sadc member states develop and enact national laws on GBV, or revise or reform existing laws on GBV in order to meet their international, continental, and regional commitments relating to human rights, and more specifically, against gender-based violence. The underlying rationale is to protect victims and probable victims of GBV, punish perpetrators, ensure that human rights are upheld in accordance with international, continental, and regional standards and requirements. So that's our rationale for developing the model law. It's a tool to help proper governance in relation to GBV. So what does GBV cover? GBV covers domestic violence, sexual harassment in the workplace, human trafficking, and sexual and emotional abuse, economic violence, etc., just to name a few. We'll come to looking at the exact interpretation or definition of GBV a little later on. When referring to GBV, the discussion is not just about the act of violence, but also about education and prevention, as well as victim assistance. That's very important. We're not just looking at the act, but at everything that impacts or is a consequence of GBV. GBV not only has terrible effects, as our guest speaker has pointed out, on the victim, but impacts negatively on society at large, with serious social and economic consequences. It is a national issue. It is a national issue, which requires drastic national interventions through the highest tool of governance, which is the law. How best can we tackle it? It can only be tackled through the law, and the law itself should identify the problems and should provide the solutions, the optimal solutions to deal with the problem. GBV, as Honorable Dube has stated, is an affront to human rights. The United Nations defines GBV as any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts, coercion, or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or in private life. Similarly, the Sadc definition goes like this. It explains it a little further. All acts perpetrated against women, men, boys, and girls on the basis of their sex, which causes or could cause them physical, sexual, psychological, emotional, or economic harm, including the threat to take such acts or to undertake the imposition of arbitrary restrictions on or deprivation of fundamental freedoms in private or public life, in peacetime and during situations of armed or other forms of conflict. So you can see it explains further the UN definition. As our key guest speaker has said, there are a lot of inadequacies in national laws when dealing with GBV. Although the majority of member states have laws in one form or the other dealing with GBV and the components of GBV, these do not seem to be stemming or eradicating GBV, meaning there is a problem, and the problem will exist until we confront it and try the best way to eliminate it. So some of the legislation, after doing vast research, we found have certain loopholes, lacunas in the legislation. Provisions lack scope or content, are fragmented, inconsistent, conflict in allocation of mandates, are ambiguous or generally vague as to meaning, privilege, entitlement, or right. They lack adequate access to justice provisions, especially this component, lack of access provisions to enable and capacitate the various players in the criminal justice and administrative systems at various stages to prevent, receive, investigate, attend, prosecute, and decide on GBV cases, and enforce decisions and protect the victims of GBV. Further, they lack adequate compliance and enforcement measures, making the law inefficacious and not having the impact it was intended to have. We normally speak of what was the intention of Parliament in coming up with this law. And we find that the intention was not fulfilled through the provision of the law. Lack adequate provisions to ensure sufficient and sustainable resources, resulting in lack of administrative and financial capacity to deal with GBV. I don't know, but this is always overlooked in most of our countries, providing financial and other assistance to fight GBV. Lack of provision acknowledging and addressing the nexus between statelessness and GBV on the one hand, and forced migration and GBV on the other hand, and lack of inclusion of asylum seekers, migrants, and others on the move, as well as stateless persons. These last two are in the majority of cases. Most member states do not deal with these issues. They just deal with mainly domestic violence. Looking at the national legislative and institutional frameworks, currently, we find that issues related to GBV are regulated and managed by various ministries and statutory authorities, with complementary support from the private sector, especially civil society organizations. These play a very big role in trying to help eliminate GBV. So in most member states, there are no independent single regulators or management units dealing with matters relating to or impacting on GBV. You'll find that there are many in scope, including gender commissions, prosecution authorities, legal aid services, women's clinics, the police service, victim support units. I'm sorry, there's someone speaking in the background. It's like distracting me. There's someone speaking in the background.
Madondo, could you mute?
The judiciary, civil society organizations, and workforce and institutional-based units. So you can see that the regulatory aspects, the legislative aspects are quite fragmented, which also helps to not do anything about GBV. It actually introduced paralysis because one institution is hoping they can do something while as the other one sits back. So we need to do much more in relation to the institutional frameworks and how they coordinate. So I think I've touched on that. So it's also important to ensure that the law provides adequate institutional framework for engagement. All players who regulate, manage, and are affected by GBV must provide a clear system for coordination, communication, and collaboration amongst themselves. This is very, very important so that we can establish and victims can establish clear lines of responsibility. So let's look at the paradigm shift in legislative systems for GBV. We believe, and from the research, the pointers are that national laws on GBV should aim at providing a four-pronged approach towards achieving a paradigm shift in the legislative systems for GBV as follows. Provide a human rights-based approach to GBV laws that address the root causes of GBV and allows for inclusion of all marginalized groups, including refugees, asylum seekers, stateless persons, and persons without documentation, and migrants, and ensure that such approach is actually applied by all respondents. So all service providers, all public institutions should apply this approach. Secondly, interface all concepts, rules, and principles to access to justice to promote a seamless connectivity for efficient handling, investigating, prevention, prosecution, protection, and enforcement of all GBV cases. At the moment, it's very fragmented and not well coordinated, not clear in responsibilities or channels of communication. Introduce innovative methods to deal effectively with GBV. For example, in this time of COVID, how best can we deal with GBV? How best can we, with all the guidelines, the rules, the restrictions that our governments have put in place to protect persons from contracting COVID? How best can we deal with this issue of gender-based violence? And ensure adequate information and financial resources are provided for intervention, prevention, protection, and enforcement, regulation, and that measures will work, be maintained, and are sustainable. The problem with our countries, I think, this thing about sustainability hasn't yet grounded itself in our legal system. We need to ground it so that we do not start something and in the middle of nowhere, you find it filters out. No, we need to sustain the vigilance over GBV. Looking at constitutions of SMEs and human rights, we feel strongly, and the research and the protagonists in this field actually point out that there is need for our constitutions to take into account when drafting, adopting, adapting, and enacting the content of GBV model laws into national laws, all the concepts and principles and measures that have been embedded in this GBV model law. But however, we still can't run away from the fact that the principle of intra-virus and ultra-virus will remain applicable to all primary and subordinate legislation and must be observed by national drafters. That's why it's important that at the constitutional level, these concepts must be embedded, especially those relating to access to justice. Most SMSs have Bill of Rights embedded in their constitutions, which, though not comprehensive, follow closely the human rights spelled out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. International human rights instruments provide an agreed set of human rights standards and establish mechanisms to monitor the manner in which human rights and freedoms are implemented. And you find that these normally relate to the legislative and the administrative measures that must be taken by member states. And you sign off on these international instruments. So you are obliged to actually carry through the nations as signed for under the international instruments. Other key human rights treaties of the UN that must be taken into account include the following: the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, and I've listed most of them. I won't go through them now because we're still coming to discuss them under the Human Rights chapter. So the GBV model law attempts to restate some of the human rights that directly impact on GBV emanating from these international instruments. These are in no way exhaustive, and the drafters of national legislation should endeavor to summarize all their state obligations at international level, analyze this, and fill in the gaps in national laws where these exist. That's very, very important. The drafter plays an enhanced role in developing legislation through policy that is coming from their instructing ministry. So they must enhance the provisions of policy to ensure that human rights are actually taken on board. Further, I would like to draw your attention to a number of legislative guidelines, guidance notes, explanatory notes, and commentaries on various human rights instruments which the UN has developed. These are good working tools for drafters of national legislation when doing the gap analysis of GBV laws. Therefore, the GBV law, as far as possible, should take cognizance of international instruments in relation to their constitutional requirements of the member states. What happens in light of our current criminal laws on GBV? Because we do have criminal laws. However, we find that these are pretty weak. So there is a need to generally review criminal laws to ascertain whether these are in conformity with this GBV model law, which is very profound and comprehensive. It will help guide the analysis and other international and regional requirements and standards. SMS may need to pass consequential amendments to the criminal laws to ensure consistency and harmony with their other national laws. Because you find that they'll have a penal law, penal act or criminal act, which deal with GBV, and then they've introduced a domestic violence act. And reading the two, you find they are not in harmony. They are not in harmony. So when the time comes to charge, you'll find that policemen tend to charge on the penal code or criminal code instead of targeting the more specific legislation, which is the Domestic Violence Act, if you have called it that way. So you need this harmonization in order to ensure that justice is actually done to the victim. The SMSs must, when reviewing the current criminal laws on GBV, interrogate gaps in the existing laws on GBV, which may bring about inconsistencies or disharmony in the legislative space governing GBV, and ascertain how these may impact on the manner GBV is perceived, prevented, handled, investigated, prosecuted, decided on, and enforced. And normally you won't find these processes and procedures in the current criminal laws, but you'll find them reflected in GBV laws. So we have to be very careful here, very, very careful. So the drafters of national legislation may wish to refer to regional and international guidelines and recommended practices that provide for police and law enforcement duties and responsibilities. For example, the Essential Services Package, ESP, is a guidance tool identifying the essential services to be provided to all women and girls who have experienced gender-based violence, including services that should be provided by the health, social services, police, and justice sectors. This package also provides guidelines for the coordination of these services. It provides standards and guidelines for health personnel, police and justice players, social and health services, and for coordination and governance of these. And you'll find that even Sadek has similar guidelines for the region. And we've used a number of these standards and embedded them into the model laws. So we have already done a lot of research for you, and all you have to do is to go to that part of the model law, especially that relating to access to justice, and you'll find most of these principles. Further, we urge national legislatures to consider a range of enforcement and compliance provisions to give effect to the GBV model law and effectively prevent or deter GBV happening. The following key factors should be considered when reviewing and crafting the GBV provisions into law: the extent to which the root causes of GBV are addressed with a view of migrating or eradicating them, the extent and nature to which GBV is provided in criminal and administrative law, whether the GBV offenses provided for contravened fundamental provisions, and the language of this model law. Because this model law, I can assure you, is a very helpful tool, and it will save you a lot of trouble in doing further research, because a lot of research has already been done. Whether the offense of GBV is provided for in the law and what the extent of the prohibitions are. We find that sometimes, I don't know whether it's carelessness or just oversight, there is no actually an offense of GBV really provided for. It's couched in such a wide manner that you can't actually charge on the provisions. So it's important to ensure that there is an offense of GBV. Whether the offenses, penalties, and compensation provisions are adequate and fit the offense specified, whether adequate investigative powers are provided for to enable evidence to be easily gathered, assessed, and used to obtain a conviction for a GBV offense. And that's where the failure of the current laws are. They do not actually go into these various stages of trying to prove evidence so that you actually get a conviction. Whether procedural fairness and justice are firmly embedded in the law, and whether there is commitment to address impunity and delays in the course of justice. So I challenge you as the media fraternity, go and pick up any law dealing in GBV in your countries and see whether any of these are actually explicitly provided for. And you'll be very surprised that they are not. So even the way you go and advocate the tool, you'll be pointing out that there are currently deficiencies in how GBV is handled at national level and legislative level. So one important lesson is that an inefficacious legislative framework on GBV may result in increase in GBV cases, lack of access to justice, and continued inequities and inequalities in society, thereby having a negative impact on socio-economic development and continued non-observance and contravention of an individual's fundamental rights and freedoms. The GBV model law will enable member states decide on whether to retain the status quo as provided in the existing institutional and legislative frameworks, amend some laws dealing with or impacting on GBV, or generally gender equality and equity, or repeal and replace some laws to ensure that they deal comprehensively with GBV and provide effective access to justice provisions. Access to justice provisions, thus creating an efficient and sustainable criminal justice and administrative systems for the fight against GBV. That's an important lesson. Let's go to customary laws and religious norms. These are very important to societies such as ours in Africa. So we need to deal with them. We can't hide behind the various little rocks that we find in our societies. SMS says customary laws and religious norms may impact greatly on women's and children's human rights, offend international commitments on GBV, good governance, and be repugnant to natural and legal justice. Customary laws are recognized as a source of law in most of our constitutions, where they are not, even in our statutory laws, where they are not inconsistent with the Constitution or an act of Parliament, or are not repugnant to natural justice. That's the baseline for most of our countries. Our constitutions recognize the freedom of religion, most at least of our constitutions. Member states must assess their customary laws, religious norms, and practices and attendant institutions, like the chiefdom. And where these are contrary to the provisions of the Constitution and Act of Parliament and this GBV model, or repugnant to natural justice, they should reform, amend such customary laws, religious norms, and practices. That's very important. We can't have them standing side by side with a new law on GBV. Obviously, you know what that will entail and where it will lead to, especially in rural areas. We should also consider persons living in rural areas where customary law is more poignant than in urban areas. Acts of general application. Again, it is very important that when we are looking at revising our laws and creating a more effective GBV law, that we look at other acts that may impact on GBV and cause a problem, like the Interpretation Acts, the Statutory Portfolios Acts, the criminal laws, the evidence codes, and the financial management provisions. These impact, and they are acts of general application. So we should not ignore them in ensuring that our provisions on GBV are supported to the optimal level by these laws and not contradict, or those laws must not be inconsistent with our GBV acts or legislation. Again, in relation to domestication, we'll come to it when we're looking at key provisions of the model law. But just to remind us that as member states and members of the UN, we have signed on and we have ratified the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties of 1969, which obligates member states to abide by their international commitments. And the best way to do that is by legislative and administrative action. We cannot use our domestic laws to further provide inequalities and inequities in society, especially in relation to GBV. So we must domesticate the laws that actually are favorable to creating an environment where GBV is actually eliminated. International law, as you all know, consists of its own realm of rules, concepts and principles and standards, which apply to the conduct of member states and international organizations in their relations with one another, and in some cases with individual groups and transnational companies. The commitments and obligations of states emanate from these rules and standards. So as national drafters, those who are going to draft the laws for us, they must take these into account. They must take them into account. Okay, and you'll see that this model law does give guidance on how you can actually domesticate these international instruments. I think I've dealt. Sorry, I need to skip quite a lot, others we won't finish. Okay, so you see some domestication. Some countries use different forms of domestication. Some, they use the dualist concept, others use the self-executing system, the monist method of domestication of international obligations. Some of you have got legislation prescribing how you domesticate international, regional, and continental instruments into your national laws. So they are applied on an equal basis as your national laws. Looking at the appropriate levels of competence and procedural fairness, you'll find that this is so fundamental in achieving the objective.
À l'équité procédurale, c'est fondamental.
So we attempt to ensure that in the GBV law, that decisions are directly taken by the appropriate authority, the competent authority, and the judicial institution or quasi-judicial institution who are actually dealing with a GBV case at any stage of the process. This is for effective and efficient decision making. And you'll find that all these terms that I've used here are actually defined terms in the GBV law. And if you study them carefully, you'll be able to point out where there is a transgression or where the procedure has been stifled or not carried out or just not complied with, because we make sure that their roles come out very, very clearly, and we state it in mandatory terms in the GBV law. And where we give a discretion to be exercised by any of those authorities, we expect that the exercise of that discretion will be proportionate and comparable in relation to the nature of the decision being made. You cannot hit a small little nail with a big hammer and expect to fulfill your objective. No, or the nutshell. It's very, very important that we understand that discretion is dangerous in exercise of the rule of law. The rule of law expects certainty, but obviously in certain cases, we have to give discretion to certain functionaries where we cannot see a contingency in the future, or where some crucial thing related to GBV has been overlooked. So some discretion will be given, but however, it must be exercised proportionately, proportionately and comparable to the issue on which a decision is being made. And the GBV model law makes sure that this principle is carried out. Further, I want to point out that survivors and victims of GBV must be given a fair opportunity to provide any relevant information before a decision is arrived at, and that decisions must be explained in a way the victim of GBV can easily understand, regardless of their background, nationality, or lack thereof. We are not only speaking of your nationals in your jurisdiction. There are other nationals living in your jurisdiction. They are also covered by the GBV. So when explaining things to them, try to be patient, or the competent authority, they must be patient, they must be tolerant, they must find a way of communicating. And they must give chance. I've seen as a lawyer, when a woman comes, the GBV case victim comes, or we take her to the police station to explain herself, they're so impatient, they can't give her a chance to explain. They keep intervening. The woman is then coward and can't go forward. So we expect that those provisions in the model law come out strongly in national legislation, because they may look small, but they are very important in accessing justice and fair justice for victims of GBV. The focus of the GBV model law. It is important to emphasize that while the focus of the GBV model law seems to be more on violence against women and girls, the GBV model law also has a gender-based approach as it applies and is of relevance to violence against men and boys. The provisions of the GBV model law read broadly, and you should read them broadly, to apply to all forms and components of GBV, to the extent of the UN and Sadc definitions, to all victims and perpetrators of GBV, be it non-gender binary persons, heterosexuals, lesbians, bisexuals, homosexuals, transgender, or gender, or people within same-sex relations or sex workers. I know this is a problem for certain member states. I know that. Zambia, for example, they don't want to hear anything related to this category. It will be war. So how do you best deal with these provisions? How do you best communicate as a media these provisions? Do you take the approach that you take, for example, South Africa as a good example of an all-inclusive society, and be persuasive as to how this should be introduced in those exclusive societies? It's really up to you to really plan on how you can do this. But it's important that we don't exclude any persons. We know what happens to these closed societies. There's grave injustice. There's grave GBV going on in those societies. So we should, as a society, be concerned. They are also humans. They need protection. So our laws need to do something to protect such persons. However, in general, regardless of orientation and occupation, women and girls are more vulnerable to and experience more sexual violence, more severe physical violence, more abuse, and more control, largely from males. And that's the reason acute focus is made on women and girls who are disproportionately affected by GBV. I don't know how to proceed SG, because I think my time has come to an end and we've still got quite a lot to cover. I'm not sure whether I should proceed. SG, moderator.
Yes, madam, I think you must proceed because they need to get the substance of the issues.
Okay, thank you very much. Further, the underlying logic of the subject areas of the GBV model law bear in mind the various categories of users of the GBV model law who will be responsible in member states for developing, drafting, approving, enacting, and implementing the GBV model law, or who have an interest in monitoring and evaluating the efficaciousness or impact of the GBV model law. Like you as the media, you'll have that role and interest in seeing what is the impact of the new law that was enacted. And you'll find at the end of the GBV model law, there's a big provision related to the role of the media in promoting and monitoring the effects of the GBV model law. Okay. I want to point out, I think this is important, and I can't just leave it out because we have no time. What Sadec's stance is on the scope of the GBV model laws on gender-based violence. I think it's important I point out to what they expect the drafters or those developing a GBV law to pay attention to. And this is what Sadec says. They state the proposed process of drafting a model law on gender-based violence in the Sadec region, initiated by the Sadec PF, is in response to the prevailing shortfalls in legislation on gender-based violence and the chronic implementation gap across the region. So you can see, I'm trying to fulfill in this model law this concern of the Sadec PF. A model law can guide these initiatives and interventions and ensure that they adhere to regional and international human rights frameworks and address the increased vulnerability due to statelessness, unequal national rights, and forced displacement. Victims and survivors often have little or no access to justice. I'm just emphasizing this because I'm trying to show you that we've come from somewhere, and somewhere is here. System to report offenses and initiate legal action to secure protection or to ensure the state investigates crimes and prosecutes perpetrators. There is a need for a model law to strengthen legislative responses in the region, provide clear guidance for law enforcement mechanisms, access to justice, and to facilitate harmonization and consistency of GBV-related cases. I urge you to read the full context of what Sadec is actually stating. Another thing I want to point out to you is CEDAW General Recommendation number 35, which was adopted on 14th July 2017 by the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which elaborates on the gender-based nature of gender-based violence, building on the work of the committee and other international human rights mechanisms, as well as developments at national, regional, and international levels. General Recommendation number 35 is a milestone in this field, as it recognizes that the prohibition of gender-based violence has become a norm of international customary law. That's very important. Expands the understanding of violence to include violations of sexual and reproductive health rights. Before it didn't, but now it does. Stresses the need to change social norms and stereotypes that support violence in the context of a resurgence of narratives threatening the concept of gender equality in the name of culture, tradition, or religion. Clearly defines different levels of liability of the state for acts and omissions committed by its agents or those acting under its authority in the territory of the state or abroad, and for failing to act with due diligence, that's very important, to prevent violence at the hands of private individuals and companies, protect women and girls from it, and ensure access to remedies for survivors. Unequivocally calls for the repeal of all laws and policies that directly and indirectly excuse, condone, and facilitate violence, and emphasizes the need for approaches that promote and respect women's autonomy and decision-making in all spheres of life. So the Sadec concept And the resolution that we have just read is an important foundation from which you can spring from as media fraternity, to point out that these are issues that we have agreed upon as nations, and we must fulfill for the benefit of the persons, the populace living within our jurisdictions. Please, I urge you to read on some of these issues. They are well analyzed in the GBV model law, and they will help greatly in advocacy. So I wish to point out again here that the GBV model law is structured in the same form as the other adopted Sadc model law, and we do not take the form of any member state's legislative style or form, because this is a model law. And a model law is just a guiding tool where you can copy and paste, or you can adapt to suit your own legislation. Again, the model law urges national parliaments to review, as I said, and reform all their national laws in favor of victims of gender-based violence and ensure that they punish perpetrators. And the most important thing which I want to before I end this explanatory notes, I want to emphasize that there is need at the national level to ensure coordination and cooperation between government agencies, CSOs, and NGOs, including international, regional, and continental organizations. You can't do it on your own as states. It's better to get assistance. The CSOs are doing a lot of work in this area, and they are vital to be included in any measures or programs relating to GBV. They will help tremendously. Now, the next parts are very short. They're expositions of the different key issues relating to the model law. They're very, very short. I didn't go in much detail, but they are also equally important. The preliminary provisions I want to go into, because this basically consists of domestication. I've explained it to you. You can read it, objective, scope, and application and interpretation provisions. I've explained those very, very well, okay? I just want to bring out this particular one in the preliminary provisions relating to extraterritorial jurisdiction of national laws. It's a very difficult thing for most member states, but when you are dealing in a forum such as ours, a Sadc organization, it's very easy to agree as member states as to transnational application of some of these laws, especially on reciprocity basis. It's very, very essential if we are going to eliminate GBV across our borders. So one of the provisions actually states a member state must ensure that any law on gender-based violence shall have extraterritorial effect so as to meaningfully give effect to certain obligations and commitments made by member states under international instruments relating to gender-based violence. The law shall apply to any offense committed outside the territory of the member state when the offense is committed by a national of another member state, by a stateless person who has his or her habitual residence in a member state at the time of the commission of the offense, or against a victim who is a national of a member state. I think this is very, very important if we are going to eradicate GBV across our borders and the scope of the law as it was intended by Sadc PF is achieved. The scope of the law is very important for GBV. And then we clearly state some of the objectives that we are trying to achieve in the model law, two of which are provide prohibitions with respect to gender-based violence, access to justice, procedural fairness, measures, strategies, and interventions in key areas relating to gender-based violence without usurping, this is important now, without usurping the powers of national legislatures or national executives to initiate and enact national laws in their areas of competence and jurisdiction. The model law is only a tool to help them, but they are exercising their sovereign rights as contained in their constitutions, as contained in the sovereignty of states' measures, to enact their own legislation, to initiate their own legislation. But we are hoping that this tool will help you effectively achieve good governance around the areas relating to GBV. Provide for legal rights, secure legal protections, and legal recourse for victims. So there's quite a number of objectives there. Please get well acquainted with them as the media, because that will help you actually advocate on the basis of the objectives. As to the interpretation, yes, we have defined a number of words. We've defined GBV very broadly. We've used international definitions where these are appropriate, right, in order not to lose the essence of our international obligations. But I want you to note three main issues or definitions which we have attached to the definition of victim. I think this is very important. So let me start off by looking at the term victim. It means a person who has been subject to gender-based violence or discrimination, and who individually or collectively has suffered harm, including physical or mental injury, emotional suffering, economic loss, or substantial impairment of their fundamental rights through acts or omissions that are in violation of criminal laws proscribing abuse of power, employment laws, or gender equity and equality laws in force in a member state, including a survivor, and the word survivor shall be construed accordingly. Now, this is what is important, what is coming. And you'll see when we say, for the purposes of the definition of gender-based violence, the following shall be included. It's not included in the initial definition, but it expounds on it. It means domestic violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, including sexual assault and sexual harassment, harmful practices, including early marriage, forced marriage, female genital mutilation, female infanticide, prenatal sex selection, virginity testing, HIV/AIDS cleansing, honor crimes, acid attacks, crimes committed in relation to bride price and dowry, maltreatment of widows, forced pregnancy, and trying women for sorcery or witchcraft, femicide, trafficking, and sexual slavery. So you can see how broad we define gender-based violence in relation to the initial definition, which were Sadc and UN definition. And then we expounded it, exploded it to make sure we leave no one behind and we protect everyone. Then another one which you should take note of is victim, for the purposes of victim. But we've expounded on it. Means it's a person who has been subjected to gender-based violence or discrimination shall be a victim, A, regardless of whether the perpetrator is identified, apprehended, prosecuted, or convicted, or there is a familial relationship between the perpetrator and the victim. I think Madame Dube touched on this. And where appropriate includes the immediate family or dependents of the victim and persons who have suffered harm in intervening or assisting the victim or in trying to prevent victimization. So if I'm present, I'm the mother of this child, and she's actually been subject to gender-based violence, when I intervene and then I'm also beaten to nothing, I'm also a victim and I can take up my complaint. Okay? So we have to be very circumspect on this. We have to make sure that no one is left behind. No one. Again, application and jurisdiction, I've discussed this. Human rights-based approach. This, I emphasize this in relation to the judicial human rights-based organization, prosecutors, legal aid practitioners, and service providers. But it equally applies to you as media. This is just for emphasis when I'm doing my presentation. So you need to know what is included. And the major issue here is taking a human rights-based approach and ensuring that we do not in any way leave out our obligations at international law. And also, we look at the policy direction to support inclusion of the human rights-based approach into legislation dealing with GBV. That's the only way we can achieve success in eliminating GBV. Again, I wish to emphasize, please, the domestication of these international instruments are very important. And you find I've listed this. You can read them in your own time. And they are clearly stated, and they are all, each and every one of these are provided for in profound language, extensively in the model law. Looking at policy direction, how does it come in? It's very important because while restating the above rights and prohibitions, the GBV model law also guides. There's a lot of guidance in the model law, which is very, very, it's not common when you are doing legislation, national legislation. But the model law, remember, is a tool to help develop the national legislation. So we include a lot of policy directions, which you can even develop as programs or as regulations to support the national, the legislative acts that you come up with. So it also guides SMS state authorities to develop policies and strategies that can effectively eliminate GBV and execute administrative acts, provide appropriate services, and interpret GBV laws more effectively. For example, SMSs are encouraged in the GBV model law to pursue the following policy objectives: promote the equal representation and participation of all gender at all levels and sectors of decision making, and ensure that gender is championed in all agenda. Ensure gender mainstreaming in all policies, structures, systems, programs, and activities in order to make them gender responsive, transformative, and contribute to the effective achievement of sustainable socioeconomic and political development. So tying these to these issues are very important, and it can be done. Take appropriate steps to modify or abolish existing laws that are discriminatory or non-inclusive, harmful, stereotypes, customs, and practices which discriminate against women, including the girl child, adolescent girls, and young women. Develop an integrated framework for the empowerment of women, including the girl child, adolescent girls, and young women. And monitor the implementation of laws, policies, and programs that affect or have an impact on women, including the girl child, adolescent girls and women. So it's very important for the model law to give this policy direction, to give a push, to mobilize into action the governments to look at these specific issues. Otherwise, they'll be left behind. So that's the essence of putting in policy directions in the model law. So it shouldn't scare you or say, but this is a model law. Why are they putting policy? No, because a model law is a tool to help you better govern and better provide legislation and programs to ensure that we'll eliminate this scourge called GBV. I've dealt quite a lot with international instruments. I don't want to dwell too much on them again, because we have stated them already. And please read these. They are very important. They are all titled and they are properly cited. You can find them on the internet. You can find them on special search stations, and it will help greatly. So some notable provisions under the human rights-based approach and policy direction part actually relates to discrimination, for example. And we go to the full extent of what we mean by discrimination. So you find the provisions read something like that, like this. If a person who performs any function or exercises any power of a competent authority, law enforcement, judicial institution, an appropriate authority, a service provider, traditional or local leader, contravenes subsection 1, meaning the prohibition against discrimination, the person shall immediately be arraigned and appropriate punishment be imposed on the person in accordance with the law. So you see, we are trying to point that do not let any transgressor of the law get away with it. People must learn to comply with the law. And if they don't comply, then appropriate sanctions must be put in the law. The government shall enact laws prohibiting all forms of discrimination in the performance of public or private functions or exercise of public or private powers, including prohibiting discrimination in economic and social life or activities, in accessing official documentation such as national identity documents, health records, and so forth. This is so important. And I can give you a very good example that Zambia has actually come up with. They have Gender Equity and Equality Act. That act is so profound because it deals in all aspects dealing with discrimination and promoting gender in all aspects of life, including what I've just read out. So you can access it again on the internet and see how far the scope of that legislation is. Because now, before we deal with any legislation in Zambia, we have to go back to that law and look at the provisions on gender before we proceed. It doesn't matter whether you're dealing with aviation or you're dealing with water resources management. You have to look at the gender aspect of the law. So we are forced to. So I would encourage most member states to have a generalized law on gender. So some of the things that are included is like the right to life. I'm sure most of you are well acquainted with it. Protection from gender-based violence is under this part. Gender-based violence actually is quite long, and I urge you to read it. Protection from inhuman treatment and security of persons. You find most of these are also contained in our constitutions. Then on the general policy direction for achieving human rights, I think this is important. Let me read it out for you, because it can also be a platform from which you spring from for advocacy in this respect. So the government shall develop gender-based violence policies and strategies, strategic implementation plans, incorporating response, preventative, supportive, and protective measures specified in this model law, including the following: promoting the equal representation and participation of women and men at all levels and sectors of decision-making, and ensuring that gender is championed in all agenda, enacting nationality laws, incorporating proper safeguards on nationality and other laws, adequately protecting refugees and stateless persons, ensuring gender mainstreaming into all policies, structures, systems, programs, and activities in order to make them gender responsive and contribute to the effective achievement of sustainable socioeconomic and political development. Taking appropriate steps to modify or abolish existing laws, customs, and practices which discriminate against women. Developing an integrated framework for the empowerment of women. Monitoring the implementation of laws and program. I didn't hear.
I think there's a cross line of interpreters, IT.
Okay.
It was Eddie who was coming through on the English channel.
Okay. And programs that affect or have an impact on women, providing funds for and contributing towards establishing comprehensive and integrated facilities to assist victims, providing adequate support to the children of victims, ensuring that the location of such support services allow equitable access to the services provided, in particular by urban and rural populations, and providing access to health care, including reproductive health care and HIV prophylaxis. So you find that most of these are prescribed in further detail in other parts of the model law. So I won't go through them as we have already seen. So the most important part of the model law, I think, are the provisions relating to access to justice, because most of our laws do not actually provide for them. So access to justice and procedural protections are very important, where a victim has a right to access to justice in the manner stipulated in Part 3 of the model law. Please read Part 3 of the model law, because it's very explicit in relation to access to justice processes and procedures. So you find in that part, it incorporates the entire proceedings and the rights of victims. For the following are notable: the right to reasonable, accurate, and timely notice of any judicial institution, proceeding, or parole proceeding involving the crime of GBV or any release or escape of an accused. The victim's right to be informed of their rights, remedies, and victim support services, and on how to obtain them, in addition to information about their role and opportunities to participate in judicial and quasi-judicial proceedings, survivor-centered approach. That is, you must take a survivor-centered approach. The right to seek restitution from the offender or compensation from the state. The right to safety and privacy, and to be free from hardship during the detention, investigation, and prosecution process, which requires legal provisions to ensure the safety, privacy, and dignity of victims and their families at all stages of the criminal justice process, such as witness and victim protection programs, measures to exclude the public from the courtroom, use of testimonial aids like screens on CCTV and support persons, and the prohibition to publish the victim's name or other intimate details. Access to free legal aid and judicial and administrative support, including interpretation services for all, including asylum seekers, refugees, stateless persons, and persons without documentation. The right to speak to a female officer where possible, whether it be the police or any criminal justice official. And it goes on. I can assure you, it's quite a lot, especially in relation to evidentiality rules, which are very important, because at the moment you'll find there's a lot of discrimination in relation to these rules. So we have provided for how you deal with evidence, how you can draw inferences and where you cannot draw inferences. We speak to how a victim can report to the police or other enforcement officers, how this should not be admissible per se, but they should look for other things like the following, which I've seen. I would urge you that it's a lot, and you should actually closely read all these provisions, because we have explained them in detail in provisions under this part. Effective response, again, this relates very much to the role of the role of the official players in the justice system, how they should respond to GBV cases when they are reported, how they should actually react. Common as at current. But now we are changing the whole system. We want a more efficient and simplified system to be introduced so that we do not cow a victim to report. The effective response is actually quite detailed, and the processes on how each and every service provider should react are provided under that part. So some notable provisions relate to the simplifying of the processes and procedures of each competent authority. You just have to read it yourself.
Cada autoridade competente.
Selected a few, but there are much more. Part 6 deals with prohibitions, offenses, and sentencing. Again, I'm targeting here the judiciary and other law enforcement officers. What do you take into account when you are dealing with the GBV case? What is the scope of the GBV provisions that you have to look for? What is the criminal element in relation to the GBV offense? All those have to be explored by these competent authorities and the right decision arrived at. So supportive measures or restraints are built into the provisions on prohibitions, such as there should not be any adverse inferences if GBV cases are reported late. There should be no offense or false accusation. There should be protection of the victim during legal proceedings. Sentences imposed should match gravity of the GBV offense without exceptions and reductions, and no mitigatory reasons or extenuating circumstances should be allowed. You find they allow too many mitigatory things. No, she provoked me. No, she was mishandling the child. So that's why I did this and that. No, we shouldn't allow this. Once GBV has been committed, it's GBV, and they must prosecute and convict. Okay, so read those provisions. There's quite a number, like we've specifically provided for prohibition of gender-based violence, and we said all forms of gender-based violence is prohibited, and provided a clue as to the type of offense or sanction that member states should actually provide for. We have also provided for collusion in gender-based violence offenses and tried to modify the rules relating to that. Okay, so I would urge you just to read the provisions. There's no time for me to go into everything under this part, but they are extensive. The prohibitions and offenses are extensive provisions. I just want to come now to the last part of my presentation relating to capacity building and awareness. I think this is very important, that we needed to provide in the model law that there is need for training of all relevant public officials, such as judges, police officers, social workers, and immigration officers, for effective GBV dictation, prevention, investigation, prosecution, protection, and awareness on GBV. Support for GBV victims, gender-sensitive judgments, and implementation of court decisions. We need to find a way of providing for training for all these officers. Otherwise, everything we are doing on paper won't just work. There'll be a problem in implementation, so there'll be a problem in achieving our objectives. The model law also sets out provisions for encouraging advocacy, activism, and communication with and involvement of the media The media is very, very important. Traditional leaders, leaders in the community, neighbors and religious leaders. Everyone should be involved in promoting and ensuring protection of victims, promoting this model law. It is also endeavors to ensure that member states allocate adequate resources for these activities. So let me end there. Again, just emphasizing on that it provides for regular monitoring, evaluation, and reporting. The model law is very comprehensive. You can see that I've been talking for 1 hour and I still haven't managed to finish all the provisions that I selected. And I only selected a few for illustration. But I'm sure from the explanatory notes, I've covered the entirety of the model law. All I do urge is that you go back and read it, understand it, and promote it. Thank you so much for listening to me. I know it was long. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Eva Jala. And you end with, all I urge is that you go and read it, understand it, and promote it. You couldn't have ended with a better phrase to capture the essence of what we are gathered here to do. And I won't be the one to stand in the way of the journalists in their bid to do exactly what you have commanded them to do, to go and read it, understand it, and promote it. And in that regard, I wish to update participants that we no longer have our next presenter, Caroline Peters, in the meeting because of other commitments. Because of that, we should now move to the most important part of the meeting, namely the plenary, where we are going to have discussions, questions, comments, which must be targeted at any of the previous presenters, in particular and including Madame Eva Jala. So at this juncture, anyone in the meeting is free to raise their hand. We can use the raise hand function to request the floor and be able to either make a comment, ask a question, or make an intervention. When you take the floor, we request that you indicate the organization where you're coming from. Do I see anyone requesting to take the floor? Colleagues, do I still have Kanban? I do. Thank you very much. That's assuring. It can be very tricky with virtual meetings. There was a story I saw from Hong Kong where a professor presented for 2 hours while he was on mute. He was a professor of economics. So I want to be sure that I have everyone on board. Are there any questions, comments?
I see Mr. Munyoro would like to ask the questions. Fitzgerald Munyoro is online.
Oh, sure. Thank you very much, Modisa, for that. I might have missed it. Mr. Munyoro, please proceed and take the floor. You are audible, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Mnyoro. I will allow for another set of questions. Joseph Munda.
Insightful presentations there. My name is Joseph Munda. I am a journalist from Zimbabwe, and I'm from Gender Media and Connect. And my comment and also request maybe that I might have is I think the issue of GBV it's not really a front page news, especially when we are looking at it from a journalist perspective. But it is a key issue, and it is an issue that has been going on. Even it has been increased, especially with the COVID, and there are a lot of dynamics around it. And I believe this can be a very good front page, and especially if we are going to be advocating for these laws to be put in place and to be practiced. I think the media sector plays a very critical role in disseminating information around these issues, because there are a lot of front page stories that we can really come up with. But for a request that I would like to put across is we'll definitely need more information, especially around good practices around some of the laws that are already being implemented by other Sadc countries, or that are being very effective, and also ways so that even in our reporting, we are not only just highlighting what is happening, but we are also highlighting the possible solutions and also possible ways in which other people are actually doing it. I think that is one of the key challenges that we have as journalists. Currently, I think we all understand the setups that we are working now. Most of us are now working virtually, and getting information is very, very scarce and difficult at times. So I think giving us such platforms like these, and also being able to share with us information around GBV itself, what is happening on the global scale, because at times we might have information that we just Google, but it might not be relevant to our context. As a Sadc region, I think there are things that are very relevant across the countries. So I think the information sharing itself, and also the linking and learning process is very important, especially also for us journalists to be able to get that information and disseminate that information. On the other hand, I think also in terms of supporting structures to be able to effectively get these stories done, you'd find most of the journalists would definitely love to be writing some of these stories, but you are limited in terms of resources or supporting structures for them to be able to run with such stories. Thereby, you find us just running on to the political stories that make front page. Not necessarily that the GBV one does not carry any weight or does not qualify to be a front page, but because of some of those limitations that we have. So, yeah, I think in a nutshell, that's my quick contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for those questions, comments. I'll take one last one before we allow our resource persons to respond. I see Obed Siamilando from Newsday. Would you like to take the floor and pose your question, Obed?
Hi, I would also like to be given an opportunity.
I've taken note, Basadi. Obed, are you in the meeting? Let me read the question that Obed Siamilandu from Newsday posted. What laws are you putting in place as Sadc / Parliament in making sure that GBV comes to an end, especially in these COVID times, where families spend most of their times locked together. Maybe let me allow Basadi to be the last one in this round of questions. You can have the floor, Basadi. You can ask your question.
Hi, am I audible?
You are audible, Basadi.
Okay, my name is Basadi Tamplin. I just consider myself as an independent civil society. I don't belong to any movement. I'd like to thank the speakers who spoke earlier for their rich contributions to the deliberations. I have 3 points that I wish to raise. There's an emerging sophisticated aspect of GBV, which may prove to be extremely difficult to tackle. This is a cyber, internet-based or virtual GBV. It will require strengthening of our cybersecurity forces. There is a lot that has been going on, particularly with the post-COVID, that is going on online, which necessitates a lot of, I would say, some new ways of tackling online GBV. Everyone has access to the internet, and we all use internet 24/7. And so has online activities increased very significantly. There are astonishing reports that cite alarming rates of online GBV, especially that the perpetrators are no longer confined to any geographical space or physical boundaries.
Espaço geográfico ou fronteiras físicas, e na maior parte do tempo os perpetradores tiram vantagem de uma forma anônima.
Cometem tais crimes, assumem a identidade de anonimidade, desde assédio, publicação de informações privadas em plataformas da internet.
As we consider the model GBV law, we will take into account the emerging, which I'll consider as a new aspect of GBV, which has always been there, but has somehow grown in its. I would say the has really grown in massive, I don't know how to describe it. In any case, I think I've captured that. My second point is on our marriages or cultural and religious practices. I know Madam Eva has already touched on that one. Most of our, or the bulk of our GBV is embedded in our cultural practices and religious practices. So, and the biggest culprit that I've often observed, I don't know if it is true for everyone, is in our marriages. And most of our countries have cultural marriages subsisting alongside common law marriages. So I think we have to look into these laws that govern our marriages and try to streamline them and see where these violations are occurring, to try and make sure that we address them from marriage laws and all other practices that go along with them. The third point is on international best practice. I believe that we can learn some lessons from other international works that have already been carried out. I know that there are international conventions that Madam Eva, sorry that I'm missing the surname right now, I noted it, has already alluded to, and that we also have, we have to explore those international, best international practices, some of them coming from the international conventions. And some of them we can borrow from some international or from some other countries that have very advanced models of GBV. I know that Scandinavian countries are often cited as some of the best countries, especially in women's issues. So they might have some best models that we can borrow from. And then we often talk about domestication. I heard Madam Eva talking a lot about domestication. Domestication is very good. I agree with it, but domestication often at times, it often confines us takes us back to our cultural practices. So in other words, we end up having defeated the purpose of what we are trying to do. So I would end on that note that can we be very careful with our with our cultural and religious practices, because they often take us back to where we are coming from. Otherwise, I thank you so much for the invitation. Hello, moderator. Am I still there? Wow.
Yes, you are. You are, Basadi. Thank you very much for those questions and comments. At this juncture, I wish to invite our resource persons to respond to any of the questions that relate to their presentation. Shall we start with you, Madam Eva?
Okay, I hope the others, like our guest speaker, I think she's got a lot of practical experience, and I would love her to support this, as well as the SG. They've got a lot of experience. But with Dr. Munyoro, on the role of the media in these issues, yes, I think they are very effective, and the protection that normally is given to the perpetrators is actually very abhorring. Because yes, in practice, this is what happens. You find, because let's say the male, I didn't want to go the male way, but anyway, the male gender is more dominant in a marriage setting or a partnership setting and so forth. So you find that they are the perpetrators. When the woman goes to report, the male gender or the husband or the partner will also go, and they will convince the law enforcement official, either through bribes, through inviting him for a drink, let's go and discuss this better, and all sorts of things. And you find most law enforcement officers, I'm sorry to say this, they succumb. I've got a case currently where this lady, she's a well-educated lady, she's a lawyer, but the husband is very, very rich. She has failed up to this date to get a prosecution. She's moved out, she's trying to get a divorce. She's been stopped at all angles because the man has got so much money and he's got so much influence. She goes here, she's blocked. She goes here, she's blocked. Yes, that is there. That's what we are trying now to deal with when we're talking about effective response. And now we are also dealing with it in the model law, where we talk about where an authority, a competent authority or law enforcement officer does not comply with the provisions of the law. That person must be sanctioned. He must be prosecuted and convicted for non-compliance with his duties and responsibility under the law. But we need a lot of activism. We need a lot of advocacy through the media for them to bring out these vices, because they are there in society. And the perpetrator becomes the champion. The victim becomes the liar and the accuser. We need to get rid of that aspect in our society, because it's really, really an injustice to the victim. For Joseph Mundo, yes, I agree with everything that he has said, and we've tried to deal with the issues raised by him through the chapter on effective response. Please read that chapter, and you'll see that we've actually gone very far and wide to ensure that these issues are actually brought to the fore. Albeit, what laws are you putting in place? This is exactly what we are doing through the model law. We are actually urging member states to go back to their national legislatures and draw up these laws, ensure that their laws are effective and efficacious to deal with GBV in the manner that he has actually pointed out. Basidi, she's raised a number of issues on cyber crimes. What is very important during the gap analysis, remember when you're doing a gap analysis and impact analysis, legal analysis, you're actually looking at all laws that would impact on GBV. For cyber crimes, most of us now have got cyber laws which actually deal with these issues. So if I'm drafting the Gender-Based Violence Act, I will actually cross-reference to the cyber law, because those are very, very strong, and they've got powerful provisions that actually deal with this aspect of cyber harassment and all those crimes which are connected and a component of GBV. And then she also asked about the cultural and religious issues. Yes, those ones we've dealt with very, very profoundly in the model law, and they actually bring out the issues relating to marriages, child marriages, and all those. All those are covered. They are covered. Then she urged us to be careful on the domestication of these international obligations. I'm not too sure what she meant, because there's no way when we are domestication that we perpetuate the ills of cultural practices, because that's what we are trying to eliminate, those bad cultural practices that continue to promote abuse and discrimination in our societies. International best practices, learn lessons from other countries, Scandinavia, yes. That's the whole essence of the model law. We've done vast research, very vast. We've taken months in doing research. It wasn't only me doing this research. We had another powerful research team which did a lot of research in these areas, and we tried as much as possible to use all the information that was recommended that we use. That's why you see it's so comprehensive. The model law is very comprehensive, but that does not stop member states when they are reenacting their laws or drafting their laws to do further research, to use further best practices and incorporate them where we have missed something. Obviously, if we're going to put in everything in the model law, it will be so bulky that no one will be able to use it. But we've tried our best to underpin at least the best practices possible in dealing with GBV. I hope I've answered some of your concerns, but I would really urge Madam Pamela and SG if they can add on.
Sure. Thank you very much, Madam Eva. I have the honor of inviting our guest, May Pamela. Please proceed.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for the questions. I think I'll try and concentrate or focus on what Joseph was talking about. He was speaking about that GBV is not a selling story. And I always argue that maybe not necessarily the truth, because GBV is you are talking violence, you are talking murder, you are talking rape, you are talking the kind of subjects or topics that really, will make any editor, angry and want to push it to the front. But it matters how you package your story. I always say no editor will say no to a good story. What is important is that, for example, if you're going to be dealing with child rape, molestation, and what have you, the moment you talk statistics and you talk a lot of things that are about the laws and what have you. It may not necessarily make it to the front page, but again, how you package the story is very important. Earlier on, I was speaking about giving face to GBV, and I made reference to HIV/AIDS era. You'll recall that when we started dealing with HIV and AIDS in the early 90s, the stigma and everything around it made sure that there was a lot of silence. But people couldn't come forward until we started seeing high-profile people stepping forward to say, I am infected with HIV, and this is how. I recall specifically in South Africa, Judge Cameron, he became an icon. He became somebody people could refer to and be able to be comfortable to speak about their issues. But it is how the media handled it, which was quite critical, because it's very easy to take somebody who steps forward to say, I'm a victim of sexual harassment, I'm a victim of rape, and make them even worse off. So it's important how we train, how we deal with our stories as journalists. I recall also back in South Africa, maybe it's because South Africans are more open than a lot of people a lot of us. A journalist, Charlene Smith, if you remember when she was raped, she went public and even wrote a lot about it and even went further to write a book about it. That demystified the issue of rape and being a rape victim and being a rape survivor so much that the moment the media started running with the stories, people could identify, people could sit back and say, I'm also a victim and I'm also a survivor. How do I? The moment people start talking about it, the laws become real. We begin to internalize the laws, and we begin to internalize issues. Also, he raised something, and I think two people raised it around issues of cultural and religious issues. I know there are a lot of sensitive issues around religious issues, but when he talks about child marriages, it depends what the laws of the land are saying. If the laws of the land are very clear that we cannot, a child below the age of 18 cannot be married off, then the laws have to be upheld. We have a situation, we have certain, ethnic groupings within our society here in Botswana, where a 13-year-old can secretly be married off. The key word is secretly, because it's against the law. But then you also have laws that are very lax, and they're not committal in dealing with these issues. I remember recently in the Botswana Parliament, they were debating it just last week, where they were saying we need to review the Children's Act, we need to review the Marital Act, because children are still being married off, and under the guise of cultural and religious aspects. So these are the kind of things that the more we talk about it as journalists, the more we get it out there, the more people are sensitive, and the more people are exposed to what is real and what shouldn't be, and what is legal and what is not legal. So my point is that as journalists, we can be the change agents that we need to be. The moment you step forward and you take off your hat and say, okay, I'm not going to be dealing with statistics, I'm not going to be dealing with this, I'm going to be dealing with a person, because we are people, we're dealing with people's lives. And the moment you deal with people's lives is how you handle your story, which will result in the impact you want to see. So the point is that let's try. It's not a bad idea to be an activist, to be able to take an activist hat, wear an activist hat, especially when you're dealing with such sensitive issues as gender-based violence. Remember that a lot of people would not easily come forward. We're talking about the justice system. We have a situation in our communities when people go to report a child molestation, for example. If parents are involved or relatives are involved, they go to the police and they are told, go back home to deal with it. How do you go back home as a young child who's been victimized by your uncle, by your father, and be able to deal with it or talk about it? These are the kind of challenges that we find our legal systems, our the police are dealing with, and we need to be able to interrogate them. And it is our responsibility as journalists to interrogate these issues so that when the laws or the lawmakers come, they know that the system that is in place, people are sensitized and people are taken to a level that they can be able to internalize such laws. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Pamela, for those very pointed responses and comments. SG, would you like to take the floor?
Well, just to really appreciate the presentation and the encouragement for us to really delve deeper into the model law and the issues that are offshoots on GBV. And just to appreciate Ms. Pamela as well for the contribution that she has done. Since this is a media workshop, I'll refrain from giving an opinion because I don't want to make news based on an opinion. But I would like for you to go, there's a report that I've just shared right now with Ms. Selin Ngube, the organizers, and our media officer, which is a report that was looking at compliance and non-compliance with the international treaties on GBV. There's a table of all Sadc member states in terms of how far they've gone, whether you look at the customary and international law, whether it's an issue of ratification and domestication of treaties agreements, whether it is the application thereof and compliance with the treaty. That table has been drawn from Angola to Zimbabwe. You can go there and look into it and begin to interrogate why this and why do we see this happening and should this be happening or not? What is prohibited? Where is the discrimination? The basis for marital status, which is an important issue that Pamela has just raised, and they cut across all other grounds where one should not be discriminated and is protected by the Constitution. So with that, let me say to you, get the report because that was the basis for the research that was done before. Now the drafter went deeper to take those and align them to how she will then be able to focus on key priorities. So all I can do is to encourage you, the data is there, dig deeper into it because I would not want to take surface inquiries and speak of one country where I'm not qualified to do so. So thank you very much, and I encourage you to further delve into the issues. But there are members of the technical working group who are in this meeting, and there are members of staff from national parliaments who deal with some of these bills that come before Parliament, who may be familiar with what the gaps are, and they may ably share and invite journalists to dig deeper into those issues at member state level. I thank you.
Thank you, SG. SG says she doesn't want to be the story. She's simply pointing you, the beacon pointing you to the story. We are moving towards lunchtime, about 1 hour behind the original schedule. And in the absence of guidance to the contrary, I wish for us to now move towards closure. And in this regard, would invite the Honorable Commissioner, Commissioner Manuela, to take the floor and give her remarks. Over to you, Commissioner Manuela.
Muito obrigada. Muito boa tarde.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I have to start by thanking you. I hope there is interpretation.
There is interpretation, Madam Commissioner.
Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much.
Devo então começar por cumprimentar
Let me start by greeting our SG of the forum, UEMO,
as nossas duas
and
preletoras que foram extraordinárias
to
para
greet our
trazer à luz
presenters who were extraordinary
o que será
in bringing
nossa
us
lei
what
modelo sobre violência
will be
baseada no gênero.
our model law for
Efetivamente,
PPDB.
muita informação, apesar do tempo ser
It
pouco,
is a lot of information,
e também
even though we did not have
agradecer a
enough time,
todos os presentes nesta sala,
and
principalmente a mídia,
also to thank all those present,
parceiros para
especially
poder
members of the media,
disseminar o trabalho
who are our
em todos os níveis.
partners in disseminating
Caríssimos,
information.
todo o protocolo cumprido.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Devo
all
então
protocol
dizer
observed,
que
I have to
segui
say
atentamente toda a discussão,
I followed quite
principalmente as
closely,
intervenções feitas,
especially the interventions,
esforços feitos para permitir a compreensão
all that was
e a
shared to
forma
allow
de
for better
podermos
understanding
disseminar
and
esta lei
ways of
modelo
disseminating
pelos
this
países da
model law
África Austral.
to Southern
A
African
honra
countries,
para a Comissão Africana dos Direitos Humanos e dos Povos, principalmente para o mecanismo que dirijo,
especially for the
está aqui
mechanism
neste momento,
that
algumas
I am
palavras
responsible for,
neste fórum.
and those that have
Porque
shared
aquele processo que nos coloca, que coloca
their
o
experiences.
lado que
It is a
o
magnanimous
lado que vai disseminar e vai fazer
process
chegar aos últimos
which shall allow us to
desta lei modelo.
disseminate this information
Com
and
esta lei modelo,
in order to reach
nós
a wider
temos,
audience.
sim,
With this model law, we would like
dentro do respeito
a framework
que temos em relação aos Estados parte,
in relation to
independência e pela
member
sua
states who respect their
dignidade como Estados parte, mas estamos a
dignity
propor
as member states,
para
but
permitir
we are proposing a model law
principalmente
to allow that
e os direitos
human rights,
humanos a
especially
nível
for
desta
women,
região da Sadec
at
tenham
this
respaldo melhor
Sadc
enquadrado,
region can be
principalmente no que toca
better
à violência
integrated,
baseada no gênero.
especially dealing with gender-based
Isso
violence.
foi enfatizado pela senhora Eva. Tenho consciência que a maior
Eva
parte das
has
nossas
emphasized,
constituições
and I'm aware that
uma
most of
coisa
our
inserida
constitutions
que
do contain something that allows
sancionar, permite proteger
a
alguma
sanction
violação
or
relacionada
some protections
com direitos
for
humanos. Mas esta
certain
lei
human
traz um
rights
foco
violations.
específico, violência baseada
But
no
the
gênero.
laws are less
E abre
specific
leque, não
to
só
certain
foi lançado
men and boys.
atrás disso. Já temos evidência que também
We have
o gênero
some
homem está
evidence
sofrendo
that men are
violação
also
baseada no gênero.
suffering
Passe
some gender-based violence.
também, provavelmente, e isto vamos
And
aperfeiçoar com esta
hopefully we shall improve our gender law,
variadas faixas mais vulneráveis.
but we have women
Na mulher migrante,
as being the most affected. I'm talking of an immigrant woman or who also suffer from this kind of violence.
enquadrada na violência doméstica. Porque
In my country, we have domestic violence
essas mulheres, essas pessoas
as
deviam ser
foreseen
protegidas.
or provided for in the law.
Creio foi a Eva que falou da
I think
mulher
it was
idosa
Eva
que também
who
sofre
spoke
discriminação e sofre
of
violência baseada no gênero.
women who also
Principalmente quando essa
face
mulher não tem
discrimination,
filhos e o marido tenha morrido. Também tem
especially
violência
if this
patrimonial.
woman does not have children and the husband is already late.
Condições que esta lei modelo traz
And we also have the terms that have been defined, especially dealing with gender-based violence. Ladies and gentlemen, I know we are approaching the lunch hour, but I think the model law shall allow member states to verify their internal legislation. This kind of legislation, they may start now, and they have to do so because they are signatories.
Institutos e convenções internacionais que protegem
international treaties and conventions. And member states that already have such legislation, they need to verify if everything is contained. Therefore, members of parliament need to have that sensitivity. And I would like to thank you for having invited me to this meeting and having invited different participants to this event, and to encourage that this presentation should be done in all member states. Let's have this model law presented to members of parliament, to civil society, to academics, so that there could be no resistance at internal level in terms of taking on board this model law. Once again, thank you very much for the time you've given me. I also preside a mechanism which we would like to also share, and also to thank you for having sent me all the material in my proper language, Portuguese. And thank you very much. Once again, thank you very much for the opportunity. This session was very fruitful.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I'm sure I speak for everyone if I say we are greatly honored to have you, and listening to your remarks, I leave with the vivid imagery of a mirror that you have given, which is what the model law is, and gives the member states an opportunity to reflect, particularly in terms of their legal framework with regards to the issue of GBV. I also take note of the request, command, and challenge you have placed on the Sadc PF and the technical working group to filter the model law to all stakeholders at national level. And the last point you made, the linguistic facilitation in terms of access to the contents of the model law. And this challenge, we will place them on the technical working group and Sadc Parliamentary Forum to carry forward. Thank you very much, Commissioner. We really appreciate your presence and your remarks. Allow me, Commissioner SG and fellow participants, to invite the ultimate speaker for the session, Madame Kialiboka Kelly Dambuza. Yes, Kialiboka Kelly Dambuza, who is from the Sadc Secretariat and is the program officer, gender-based violence, and has the honor and task of delivering closing remarks. Madame Dambuza, you have the floor.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's afternoon on my end. And thank you, Mr. Facilitator, for the opportunity you have presented for me to share the closing note for this meeting. It has indeed been a good one. Let me just start by really acknowledging our Secretary General and the Sadec Parliamentary Forum, Ms. Skoma, our gender activist, Ms. Pamela Dube. It's good to see you. The Honorable Commissioner, Maria Teresa Manuela, Eva Jala, our drafter. It has been a good journey. Members of the technical working group, the distinguished delegates from the media fraternity here present. Ladies and gentlemen, let me just greet you all. And also let me just indicate that I share these remarks on behalf of the Executive Secretary of Sadec. She couldn't be here because of other commitments. We value this exercise very much as the Sadec Secretariat. We see this as an instrument that will facilitate a greater engagement and commitment by the Sadec member states in the response to gender-based violence. Let me start by highlighting that Sadec is very much committed to addressing the issue of gender-based violence in our region. We have seen that through the Sadec Protocol on Gender and Development that was developed in 2008 and was further revised in 2016 to ensure that it's aligned to emerging issues, to the latest international and regional instruments that are promoting human rights accordingly. So let me just also acknowledge this meeting, that it has been a good one. Someone said something very interesting at the beginning, that the media has been identified as the first group to be consulted in the development of this model law. This is very much in recognition of the crucial role that the media plays in terms of taking the news to the people, sharing information that is key, and also being the protectors of our communities accordingly. So I just want to say this was really a very informative and a participatory session. It's just that time was really short. I could see that the media personnel here present were really looking for opportunities to engage further and further. And I believe throughout this journey, they will get that opportunity to engage in this process. There are still going to be other consultative meetings with other stakeholders accordingly. Indeed, we do all agree that the media plays a key role in protecting the rights of people to information and speech, and in particular in reaching out to the marginalized communities across the region and in hard-to-reach areas with current information that can actually empower our communities. Ladies and gentlemen, we also note that the meeting highlighted that gender-based violence remains a global and a regional crisis. We have seen that things were made worse also by the COVID-19 epidemic that we saw. It resulted in a 30% increase in GBV cases across the world. I believe we all agree that the proposed Sadec model law is really what the region needs to strengthen the response to gender-based violence accordingly. It has been highlighted that this is an 8-part model, and it really contains the provisions that highlight key measures to eliminate gender-based violence. I just want to highlight in brief that we saw that the model law, it's communicating clearly the policy content and recommendations on best practice legislative provisions for inclusion in the national laws on gender-based violence. It calls upon the member states to adopt measures to eliminate gender-based violence and to prevent its occurrence and protect survivors of gender-based violence in an inclusive manner. We also note that it captures the rights relevant. It captures the rights relevant to the topic of gender-based violence, as aligned to human rights treaties that have that preceded this draft model law. We also note that the model law expands the right to access to justice for survivors and also support mechanisms for victims to ensure that this right is realized. It contains provisions for elimination and prevention of gender-based violence, and it sets out standards on effective response mechanisms and referral systems. We also note that the issues of information and data concerning gender-based violence are also emphasized in this instrument to facilitate understanding of the problem of gender-based violence in order to deal with it effectively and comprehensively. We also note the provisions on implementation of the law, including a proposition of punishment for perpetrators and a monitoring mechanisms under the Sadc. So I just want to say this is indeed a really comprehensive instrument we are going to receive in the Sadc region. And to highlight that if this instrument is domesticated accordingly, this model law will really help participating Sadc states to meet their international commitments that are expressed in ratified international and regional laws and standards, such as the CEDAW and the CRC. These we will appreciate as instruments that call upon member states to take legislative and policy measures to advance the human rights of women and children and to protect them from abuse. Just let me highlight that, we note that states that are already adhering to some of these international instruments will find it easy to incorporate this law into their own domestic legislation and policies. So we hope that the end result will really be a strengthened Sadc community that is really better equipped to eliminate this scourge of gender-based violence. Let me take this time to appreciate the participation of the media. Maybe media community here present take this initiative and raise awareness in their communities accordingly across the region with the aim to ensure that no one really is left behind and that at the end of the day, we're really able to eliminate gender-based violence. I also like to say as a closing note that I thank the organizers for this session, the speakers and all the attendees. We also note the effort of the Sadc Parliamentary Forum, together with the technical working group that has been established to work with Ms. Eva to put this model law in place. We note those tireless efforts to ensure that this Sadc model law on gender-based violence is an instrument that is ready and that is comprehensive for the consumption by member states. So let me thank you all and have a blessed day. Thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dambuza, for those closing remarks. And as we drift towards closure of the meeting, I wish to highlight the remarks by the Secretary General that I don't want to be the story, but just the beacon that points to the story, and that story is the model law. Allow me to also quote what Ms. Jala said. Here is the model law to the media. Read it, understand it, and promote it. And lastly, the words of Madame Dambuza, who says, make sure that no one is left behind. We count on the media. They have been deliberately picked as the first stakeholder, and we will have the privilege of peeping through when other stakeholders are engaged. The intention being that they continue to carry the word in terms of promoting the model law and making sure that no one is left behind. At this juncture, I wish to find out from Sally, from Modise, if there is anything else that needs to be brought to the attention of participants before we close the meeting.
Thank you, Director of Ceremonies. Not at the moment, just to say we extract the register and communicate all the reports and documents from this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So there is assurance that the documents from the meeting will be shared with participants. Modise, anything else from your end?
Nothing from my side. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much. So at this juncture, allow me to declare the meeting as officially closed. And